On my wedding day to Sophie, the man she despised most called for her help. "Sophie, save me, I've been kidnapped." Everyone said that Sophie loved me dearly and utterly loathed Ethan. It was because I had once heroically saved Ethan, only to be crippled and left in a vegetative state by his enemies. For 3 years, while I lay unconscious, Sophie would constantly say, "Such a foolish man, I don't know why I saved him." It was a waste of 3 years of my life, yet she secretly handled countless messes for him. Even on our wedding day, she left me at the altar apologetically saying, "I'm so sorry, I have to save Ethan. He was kidnapped because of me. I only have eyes for you, Sebastian. I'll be back to marry you. This wedding won't be cancelled." The entire city was laughing at me, but I walked towards Victoria, Sophie's stunning sister, in the audience. I said, "Sophie's right. I'm not canceling the wedding, but who the bride isn't important. Victoria, for the rest of our lives, please take care of me." Later, Sophie frantically searched for me, only to find me standing before her with another woman. The woman, with an icy, haughty gaze, said, "Sophie, call me brother-in-law." A sharp, piercing pain shot through me. I slowly opened my eyes. 3 years ago, Sophie and I were planning our wedding. As I basked in the joy of becoming her husband, disaster struck. I happened to see Ethan being beaten by his girlfriend's lover and his accomplices, so I intervened. He was eternally grateful, yet he still pestered his ex-girlfriend daily, begging her to return to him. Eventually, his girlfriend's lover blamed everything on me, ambushing me on my way to work to exact revenge. On the eve of the wedding, I lay bleeding in a back alley, falling into a coma. 3 years passed like that. "Mr. You're finally awake." Familiar cries reached my ears. I opened my eyes to see Martha, her eyes brimming with tears, frantically pressing the nurse call button. Doctor, Mr. S is awake." Martha grasped my hand, overjoyed. "Mr. S, you're finally awake. I'll tell Miss Sophie right away. You wouldn't believe it, but in these 3 years, Miss Sophie has been through hell. She was so distraught, several times she almost gave up on life. She stayed by your side every day, finding the best team to treat you. Even your food, clothing, and shelter were personally managed by her. She never delegated a single task. I know Sophie was very good to you and loved you very much. If not for that accident 3 years ago, you would have been married long ago." Hearing Martha's words, the confusion and fear of my awakening dissipated somewhat. I leaned against the headboard, my voice weak. "Martha, where's Sophie? Since she was by my side day and night, why don't I see her now?" Martha's expression turned complex, her silence prolonged. Just as I feared something had happened to Sophie, she sighed. "It's all because of that useless Ethan. Miss Sophie went to deal with his mess. She constantly complained about Ethan, saying she hated him. If it weren't for him, you wouldn't have been hurt by his ex-girlfriend. He caused so much trouble for Miss Sophie these years. The Shu family had to clean up after him. Miss Sophie hated him with a passion. Just the sight of him repulsed her." I fell silent. If Sophie truly despised someone, would she repeatedly help him? Everyone said she deeply loved me, and I believed it. But at this crucial moment of my awakening, she was with the man she hated most. I shook my head, dismissing the absurd thought. Perhaps she didn't know I'd wake up today, I told myself. "How are you feeling?" A cool voice sounded above me. I looked up into a pair of amber eyes, clear and pure, like the waters of a spring pond. I shook my head, my voice hoarse. "Everything's fine. Thank you, sister." The woman stiffened. Though her white coat concealed her figure, her beautiful face, partially hidden by a mask, was exquisitely sculpted. It was Victoria, Sophie's younger sister by 5 years. She was said to be disinterested in family matters and dedicated to her medical career. Since I became a vegetable, I had been recovering in her hospital. "The examination shows no problems. Get some rest. Come back if you have any issues." Victoria removed her mask, frowning. "Where's Sophie?" Before I could answer, Martha explained, "It's that Ethan again. He's caused trouble for Miss Sophie. She's always cleaning up after him. Sometimes she even forgets about Mr. S. That man is a good-for-nothing loser." I instinctively said, "It's not like Sophie didn't go willingly." Both of them looked at me, especially Victoria, with a meaningful expression. The atmosphere turned subtly tense. Martha seemed to realize she'd said something wrong, cautiously watching me. "Mr. S., please don't be angry. I just spoke without thinking. Miss Sop." "Victoria, my sister cares most about you. If you hadn't saved Ethan 3 years ago, Sophie wouldn't have given that man a second glance. She detests him. His presence always irritates her." I took a deep breath, composed myself, and said, "It's all right. I think I was overthinking it. I know how Sophie feels about me. She's even willing to sacrifice her life for me. She's been unwavering these past 3 years. I have no reason to doubt her." An hour later, after my checkup, it was 9 o'clock at night when Sophie burst through the door. "Sebastian!" she cried, appearing in the doorway, a vision in a black suit, looking thinner but captivating, the same Sophie from 3 years ago, yet somehow more mature. I smiled, studying her carefully. "Sophie," I said, "you've been through so much these past 3 years." Indeed, she had been by my side day and night, tirelessly devoted to my care, her usually clear brow now etched with weariness and age. Sophie could contain herself no longer. Eyes red, she rushed into my arms. "Sebastian," she sobbed, "never leave me again." Her small frame held me tightly, almost painfully so. "We'll get married immediately," she declared, her voice hoarse. "I'll never lose you again." My heart stirred. I was deeply moved. I was about to agree when I saw a man in the corner, his face etched with sadness and hurt, his eyes brimming with unshed tears, gazing at Sophie's back. If I remembered correctly, it was Ethan, the man I'd saved 3 years ago. Seeing my silence, Sophie frowned as if sensing something. Following my gaze, she saw Ethan. In that instant, I felt her arms around me tremble and tighten, a tender embrace turning rigid. "Sophie, what's wrong?" I asked. She finally realized her reaction and released me. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, her eyes filled with regret, before anxiously checking my condition. "Sebastian, it's my fault. I got carried away." Martha chimed in. "Miss Sophie is just overexcited. You've been asleep for 3 years. She was terrified of losing you again." "Is that so?" I asked, smiling faintly, meeting Sophie's gaze. Her usually proud eyes were filled with a love only for me. "Don't be silly," she said. "Of course it's true." At that moment her eyes held only me, but that fleeting distraction. Who was she thinking of just now, Ethan? Aware that we had seen him, hesitated before entering. "Mr. S.," he said, a hesitant smile playing on his lips, a mixture of respect and fear in his eyes. "You're awake." "That's wonderful." Sophie frowned impatiently. "Didn't I tell you to go home? What are you doing here?" Ethan stood silently, offering only a polite smile, just as he had 3 years ago, gentle and well-mannered. I spoke softly. "It's all right. Have a seat." Sophie's face remained grim, her displeasure evident. Ethan, naturally, didn't dare say anything, standing there awkwardly. I sighed. "He hasn't done anything wrong, Sophie. Don't be so harsh. He knows he can't do anything right, yet he always tries to prove himself," she retorted coldly. "I don't understand why he's here. It's just annoying." Martha added, "Miss Sophie is right, Mr. Ethan. You really are trouble. It's best if you don't show up again. It's bad luck." Sophie glared at Martha. "When did it become your place to speak?" Even I was stunned. Martha had been by my side for years. Sophie had always been respectful and kind to her. Yet she'd just spoken to her so sharply. I frowned, a feeling of unease settling over me. Although Sophie clearly showed her dislike for Ethan, she only allowed herself to scold him. If anyone else dared to say anything, she would jump to his defense. "Sophie," I said, "Martha shouldn't have said that. I apologized to Mr. Ethan on her behalf. Sophie reacted instantly, glancing at me, a fleeting panic in her eyes. Sebastian, I'm sorry. That's not what I meant. Victoria's eyes darkened, and she looked at Ethan with a hint of disgust. Aren't you going to leave? Must you disturb us? Ethan's eyes reddened, but he forced himself to remain calm. He said in a low voice, I just wanted to make sure Mr. S was all right. I wanted to thank him in person, Mr. S. Thank you for saving me that day. I replied nonchalantly with a smile. It's all right. I asked, That woman hasn't been bothering you again, has she? Ethan smiled brightly. Thanks to Sophie. She hasn't bothered me for a long time. Sophie's face fell. If you're stupid enough to get involved with her again, even if she has you beaten to death, I won't bother picking up your corpse. Ethan's demeanor became weak again. He stammered, I won't. Heavy feeling settled in my chest. I wondered if I was overthinking things. Why did it feel like there was an atmosphere between Sophie and Ethan that I couldn't penetrate, even though she seemed to dislike him so much? After the others left, only Sophie and I remained in the hospital room. Unlike her coldness and distance in front of others, she was always gentle and indulgent with me. She said, Sebastian, this time, don't leave me again. As her eyes, full of deep affection, rested on me, the strange feeling I had sensed between her and Ethan faded, making me doubt if I'd been imagining things. Her gentle eyes wouldn't lie, wouldn't deceive. I knew what her love looked like, and I was certain she still loved me, as always. I replied, I won't be so impulsive again. I suppressed the strange feeling in my heart and pulled her into my arms. At the Clearwater Bay Villa, the car pulled up to the entrance. Sophie opened the door and reached out to support me. I frowned. I don't need help. I can walk by myself. But Sophie insisted, 3 years ago I loosened my grip and you left me for 3 years. This time I won't let go. A pang of pain shot through my heart. I couldn't help but caress her cheek. Yes, she had waited for me for 3 whole years. Sophie leaned over and kissed my finger. Sebastian, she said, I'm going to marry you. I can't wait any longer. I'll announce it to Seabrook tomorrow. The wedding is back on. The night was still, the shadows swaying. I didn't expect the 3-year-old marital home to be unchanged, exactly as it was before my accident. The grand hall, the high staircase, the wall-to-wall carpeting, even the artwork on the walls, nothing had been moved. Sophie hugged me from behind, her breath warm against my neck. Your Chinese fir trees have grown so tall, she whispered. I was surprised. The grove is still there. I planted those myself 3 years ago to celebrate our wedding. Of course, she replied, pushing her hair back. With utmost seriousness, she said, every day I come to tend to them, because I knew you wouldn't want to see a desolate landscape when you woke up. My earlier suspicions about her and Ethan seemed laughable, I said. Sophie, I'll never leave you again. Her breathing became rapid and she leaned in to kiss me. A gasp echoed. Sophie froze. We both stiffened, looking around, but saw nothing. I frowned. It sounded like it came from the backyard. Did Martha have an accident? Sophie's expression was grim, but not surprised. Wait here, I'll be right back. She strode towards the back garden with a troubled face. I followed her, curious. The sound had seemed to come from the grove. A familiar figure struggled in the bushes, calling for help. It hurts. Oh God. I stopped. It was Ethan. He was entangled in the Chinese fir vines, struggling helplessly, his arms bleeding. Sophie's face was dark as she rushed over and pulled him free. You idiot! What are you doing here? Ethan straightened, his body shrinking, his voice shaky. I'm sorry, I just wanted to help take care of Mr. S.'s Chinese fir trees. Sophie's expression changed slightly, but her anger remained. I've told you how many times. I don't need your help. You only hurt yourself and make a mess of things. Ethan retorted. But I was just repaying Mr. S. What does it have to do with you? Then looking at me with guilt, he said, Mr. S., I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disturb you. I can only do these small things to repay you. I walked over and said softly, It's all right, the important thing is that you're okay. But Sophie was still furious, glaring at Ethan with disgust. You can't do anything right. Just stay put and don't cause trouble for others. Although her words were harsh, I saw her staring intently at Ethan's bleeding wound. The warmth in my heart suddenly turned cold. Perhaps others couldn't see it, but I could tell Sophie was worried about him. Ethan shrank back and ran off. Sophie's words were too harsh for him to bear. Even the most subservient man retains a shred of self-respect. My voice was softer now. It's late, I said. Go home. Sophie hadn't yet come to her senses. Her eyes were dark, fixed on the direction Ethan had left, filled with disgust, yet her expression was dazed. I knew she was worried about him. Sophie, I said, my voice growing colder and louder. Sophie finally snapped out of it, looking at me with regret. I'm sorry, she said. He damaged your redwood grove. I'll compensate you. She thought I was angry because of Ethan's clumsiness. I smiled faintly, a smile devoid of warmth. It's all right, Sophie, I said. Redwood touched by another's hand is redwood I don't want. No need to be upset. Her face froze for a moment. I gently withdrew my hand, looking at her intently. Sophie, I said, you know me. I'm a stubborn man. If what you give me is the same as what you give others, then I'd rather have nothing. That's always been my nature. I only want what belongs solely to me. I don't want fickle affections, only a unique and profound love. Sophie's face darkened for a moment, then she hugged me tightly, her voice hoarse. I'll always be only yours. Good, I replied, returning the hug. I'd been asleep for 3 years. A lot had happened in those 3 years. For instance, during those 3 years, Sophie had cleaned up countless messes Ethan had created. Ethan, to his credit, tried to help, but he always messed things up. Sophie would then grimly cover for him. Everyone said Sophie hated Ethan. Even Sophie herself believed it. She said to me, such a clumsy man. I don't know why you saved him. You wasted 3 years of your life. I smiled at her. If I hadn't saved him, he would have been beaten to death. Would you have been able to bear that? Sophie stiffened, immediately hugging me tighter. What are you talking about? She asked, playfully kissing me. How can he compare to you, Sebastian? Tomorrow's the wedding. I'm finally marrying you. She seemed both wistful and content. From tomorrow on, you'll be my legal husband. I wanted to believe her. This woman's love for me was the same as before, unchanged. The only difference was that she, always cold and aloof and expressionless in front of others, would show uncontrolled emotions in front of Ethan, even if it was just annoyance and impatience. But Ethan had become someone special. The wedding day. The wedding, 3 years overdue, was finally here. Every detail was perfect, the ceremony went smoothly. Sophie stood before me, more beautiful than ever. We stood opposite each other, our family and friends below. This grand wedding drew half the city. It was even broadcast city-wide. Yet, amongst all those people, she only seemed to see me. The officiant said, Miss Sophie, do you take Mr. S. to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer, until death do you part? Her eyes were slightly red. Just as she was about to answer, a jarring sound erupted from the speakers, followed by a man's cry for help. Sophie, save me! It was Ethan's voice. Sophie's face instantly changed. Ethan, what's wrong? She exclaimed. Sophie, save me, that woman's back. She brought people, she wants to kill me. The signal was cut, replaced by a woman's arrogant voice. Sophie, come here now with the ransom or you'll never see Ethan again. Sophie was in a panic. She instinctively reached to take off her wedding ring. I grabbed her hand. Sophie, what are you doing? She looked at me apologetically. I'm sorry, I have to save Ethan. He's kind and honest. If I don't save him, he really will die. I took a deep breath, suppressing my anger. We can leave this to the police. Even if you go, you can't do much. Even so, you still want to go? She only hesitated for a moment before saying, he only trusts me. If I don't go, he'll be terrified. I had to face the fact that she had changed her mind. I feigned composure. Sophie, even if you go to save him, it will make me the laughingstock of everyone, ruin my reputation in the city, and make my family a laughingstock. Are you still going to leave me for him? This time she didn't even hesitate. I'm sorry, Sebastian, she said. I'll compensate you for all of this. The man I want to marry has always been you. I'll be back. I clenched my fists, my eyes turning cold. Sophie, I said, think carefully. If you leave, the wedding is off. Her steps faltered only for a moment. In front of everyone, she turned and left without hesitation. Reporters swarmed. Within a day, Sophie's elopement would be all over the city. As the jilted groom, the one publicly abandoned, I would become everyone's topic of conversation. I stood there, watching her receding figure. The flashbulbs meant for me now felt like daggers. I stood amidst the crowd, the spotlight now a spotlight of shame. The ceremonial sword, a symbol of a bride's public abandonment, fell, cleaving me open, leaving me bleeding profusely. The guests buzzed. The bride eloped. What's going on? Weren't they the perfect couple? Someone muttered. Sophie used to adore Sebastian, another commented. I envied him. But to do this, to elope, leaving him at the altar, that's unforgivable. Whispers followed, speculating about the mystery man who could make a woman so devoted to Sebastian abandon him at their wedding. A chill ran down my spine. I felt like I was sinking into an icy grave. The guests' gazes ranged from schadenfreude to pity, some shaking their heads with a mournful air, as if I were some pathetic figure. I always envied Sebastian, one said. Even after he became a vegetable, Sophie stayed by his side, caring for him for 3 years, never looking at another man. And now this. Another chimed in. I heard it's the man Sebastian saved. He'd been hovering around Sophie since Sebastian's accident. One thing led to another. A sigh followed. Honestly, she could have found someone else. This is like twisting the knife in Sebastian's heart. I wonder if he regrets saving Ethan now. My father, his face ashen, stormed onto the stage, grabbing my arm. Let's go, Sebastian. We won't take this. He'd always liked Sophie. Now his eyes burned with anger. My son won't be humiliated like this. Sophie's parents rose, looking apologetically at me. Sebastian, we're so sorry. This is entirely Sophie's fault. We apologize on her behalf. Sophie's mother, her face etched with guilt, tried to soothe my parents. It's all Sophie's fault. The Shoes won't shirk responsibility. But considering how she cared for Sebastian for so many years, could you give her a chance? Sophie's father added with authority. Sophie cares for you. She wouldn't have made promises to return and made you wait if she didn't. She must have her reasons. My father retorted, what kind of reasons could make her abandon my son like this? Everyone heard that man's call for help, but she's neither a police officer nor related to Ethan. At most, she's his benefactor's fiancée. What right did she have to leave Sebastian to save him? He revealed my benefactor's identity. Silence fell over the room. They seemed to recall why I was in a vegetative state, because I saved Ethan. But I hadn't anticipated that years later my wedding would be interrupted again because of him. Sophie's mother's composure faltered. We've apologized already. We need to wait for Sophie to explain. I cut her off. No need. I stepped in front of my father, shielding him from her. Years ago, my act of bravery landed me in this predicament. I focused on my own goodness, forgetting my family's needs. Seeing my father's graying hair, my heart ached. It was time to take charge. Composing myself, I declared firmly, I've made it clear if Sophie takes one step forward, the wedding is off. The room erupted. The Shoes' faces were grim. Sophie's father bellowed, What are you doing? Your engagement has been set for so long, you can't just call it off. Sebastian, don't be rash, I sneered. The one who eloped is being rash and you're blaming me? I know people are protective of their loved ones, but this was blatant disregard for the facts. Sophie's mother, who was about to scold me, paused. Her eyes reddened. Sebastian, we're not trying to deny you justice, but it's an emergency and we're hurting too. You know she's a good person. She waited for you all these years, even when you were incapacitated. It's understandable that she'd go save Ethan. Sophie's father caught her meaning. They exchanged a glance. He said, My wife's right. The most important thing is Sophie and Ethan's safety. Ethan said he was kidnapped on the phone. Sophie rushed to save him. As her fiancée, your first reaction isn't concern for her safety, but to end the engagement? Is that fair to someone who cared for you for 3 years? A master of corporate diplomacy, he first addressed Sophie's mother as my wife, treating me as family, only to slap me with his words afterward. They warned me against acting rashly, urging me to focus on Sophie's safety. I scoffed. First, I said, the wedding is off. I have no connection to the shoes. Sophie's mother is not my mother. Second, kidnapping is a matter for the police. We can provide any helpful evidence, but that's the most sensible course of action. Sophie had bodyguards, and she left from the wedding venue. Unless she deliberately put herself in danger, her bodyguards would never let anything happen to her. If she truly intended to die, you two would have been frantic already, wouldn't you? After all, Sophie is your only daughter. Mr. and Mrs. S fell silent, their faces grim. I continued, my tone flat. Finally, Sophie's impulsive actions stem from her infatuation with Ethan. It was her choice, a risk she took for love. What else can I say? Silence reigned. As I turned to leave, Sophie's father, Sebastian, stopped me. Sebastian, he whispered, think carefully. If the wedding is cancelled, will the partnership between the S family and the Shu family also be cancelled? For the Shus, it's just a financial loss, but for your declining family, it's a catastrophic blow. Sophie's mother, her face equally somber, added, While we're still giving you face, let's find a way out. Sebastian, you should know how important this wedding is. They finally dropped their pretense, revealing their true hypocritical selves. Compared to their daughter and the Shu family's interests, what was my humiliation? My father, his eyes blazing, roared, Our family isn't so desperate that we need to profit by sacrificing our son's dignity, even. If it's a catastrophic blow, I won't let anyone ridicule Sebastian. I took a deep breath and stood beside my father. Dad, I said, they're right. The wedding can't be cancelled. My father's expression changed, his disapproval evident. I shook my head, signaling him to trust me, then looked down at the audience. The hall was packed. The whole city was watching. The wedding was lavish. Our love envied by all, yet she eloped before everyone, making me a laughingstock. This, apparently, was proof of a woman's fickleness. I chuckled wryly, my gaze settling on a figure in the crowd. The audience's expressions ranged from pity and mockery to sympathy and scorn. But one woman remained impassive, her eyes betraying no emotion. It was Victoria, Sophie's older sister, the most respected woman in the room. I walked towards her, my voice calm. Let's continue the wedding, I said. Victoria slightly raised her eyes, giving me a questioning look. Why? She asked, her composure unwavering amidst the shock of everyone else. I looked into her eyes. Victoria, I asked, will you marry me? Victoria sat there serenely, as if anticipating this. She lifted an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in her eyes. Are you sure? She asked. I am Sophie's sister. The crowd gasped, staring at me in disbelief. Sophie's father exploded. Sebastian, are you insane? Her mother was equally shocked. I know you're upset about Sophie running away, but you can't just marry any woman. I offered a faint smile. Of course not. Your sister is the best woman for me. Sophie's father raged. You know she's your sister, shameless." My father looked at me in astonishment. "Sebastian," he began, "Dad understands your anger. If you cancel the wedding, Dad will fully support you. But," he paused, looking at Victoria with a complex expression. Victoria was indeed Sophie's sister, but much younger, only a few months older than Sophie and 5 years younger than me. The Schuss were the most prominent family in Seabrook. Mr. Shu had numerous children, dozens of sons and daughters. Sophie's father was the 5th son, but Sophie was the eldest grandchild, considered the jewel of the family, expected to inherit the family business. However, Mr. Shu's favorite was Victoria, his long-lost granddaughter found after many years. Her father was Mr. Shu's first son from his first marriage, who had died young, a loss that haunted Mr. Shu. This son had a daughter, raised by his widowed mother away from the family's cutthroat environment. Sophie's father, ruthless in his quest for power within the family, had successfully secured his share of the family fortune, but he craved more. Mr. Shu, however, wanted to prevent any one branch from dominating the family. Then Sophie was born, brilliant and capable, assisting the family in various matters even before she came of age. Despite his reluctance, Mr. Shu had to favor Sophie and her father. It was then that Victoria was brought back into the family. Her return represented the sprawling mansion underwent a significant restructuring, but no one anticipated that Victoria was actually Mr. Shu's eldest granddaughter. Mr. Shu in his younger days had a string of romantic entanglements. It was rumored that before his rise to prominence, he'd already been married to his original wife. Like many a self-made man, his wife, who had supported him in his climb to success, became his forgotten spouse. Their eldest son, who died tragically young, became a constant source of sorrow for Mr. Shu. Later, Mr. Shu founded the Shu Corporation, becoming the wealthiest man in the city, accumulating numerous offspring, both acknowledged and otherwise. Yet, in his twilight years, he found himself alone, without a single grandson. But even this was enough. His descendants were too numerous to count. No one in his social circle knew the details of his original wife's identity, nor did anyone particularly care. She was, after all, merely an abandoned woman. Years later, Mr. Shu found unexpected renewal, reuniting with his original wife in his 50s. Their long-lost eldest son, it turned out, had a child, Victoria. Victoria was only a few months older than Sophie, Mr. Shu's first granddaughter. Initially, everyone assumed Victoria was an illegitimate child, but when her father's identity was revealed, everyone fell silent. Victoria was brought back to the Shu family home but retained her mother's surname. Sebastian, Mr. Shu's 5th son, vehemently opposed this. He'd been expecting the inheritance, only to be confronted by Victoria, vying for the same position as Sophie. He saw Victoria as a thorn in his side. He declared, "Father, even if she's my brother's child, what does she have to do with the Shu family? Though she is your flesh and blood, she doesn't even bear the Shu name. Why should she inherit the family's legacy?" Mr. Shu roared, "Shut your mouth, you ingrate!" A sharp slap followed. "Even if she doesn't bear the Shu name, she's my own flesh and blood. Why wouldn't she be entitled to my inheritance? I'm not even dead yet, and you're already eyeing my assets? Do you even have any respect for me?" Sebastian fell silent, humbled by his father's fury. However, the prospect of sharing his anticipated inheritance with a relative he barely knew left him deeply resentful. The two families had engaged in numerous subtle power plays. Victoria's attendance at Sophie's wedding was merely a facade, a gesture to preserve appearances for Mr. Shu's sake. His father sighed deeply, gripping my arm, whispering, "Even if you're angry, don't involve Victoria. You know her relationship with the Shu family is complicated." I interrupted, "Father, you heard them. We can't call off the wedding." I looked the couple squarely in the eyes. For the G family, a broken engagement would be catastrophic. An alliance with the Schuss is vital for our company's survival. But who we marry is none of their business, I added. Before I could finish, Mr. Schu interrupted. Sebastian, you know this marriage is necessary for your family, not because Sophie is begging to marry you. You need her. Knowing this, don't let your anger with Sophie lead you to cancel the wedding. Mrs. Schu stepped forward, her initial remorse replaced with impatience. Sebastian, Sophie has devoted years to caring for you after your accident. She's committed to marrying you, so why are you fixated on her brief escape? I laughed. So Sophie's escape is my fault? I paused. You're right. I never intended to cancel the engagement. Their expressions softened. Before they could speak, I turned to Victoria. There are other women in the Schu family suitable for marriage. I stepped closer, locking eyes with Victoria. Victoria, I haven't received your answer yet. Will you marry me? A deathly silence fell over the room. No one expected my serious proposal. Mr. Schu roared. You were merely angry. I overlooked your outburst. But if you truly humiliate my family, don't blame me for retaliating. I ignored him, my gaze fixed on Victoria. Mrs. Schu tugged at her husband's arm, casting a disdainful look at me. Let him continue. Victoria is aloof, rarely interacts with men, and being proposed to in this setting. Do you think she'll accept? It's just another chance for Sebastian to be ridiculed. Then another voice cut through the silence. All right, let's get married. Victoria interrupted her mother-in-law, a faint smile playing on her lips. Her captivating eyes, however, held an icy undercurrent, a strange mix of warmth and coldness. I saw Mr. and Mrs. Schu's faces contort in displeasure, stiff and restrained, their anger barely contained as they watched Victoria. Victoria, what does this mean? They asked. Nothing, she replied, a hint of amusement in her eyes as she looked at me. Wasn't it decided we were to be married? Come here, she said. Relief washed over me. I walked to her side, took her hand, and said, I'll do my best, sister. I whispered the last word in her ear. Victoria glanced at me, her expression unreadable. A light chuckle escaped her lips. You're quite bold. Aren't you afraid I'll refuse? It was a gamble. If she refused, I would be the laughingstock of the entire event. I didn't respond, though the sweat in my palms betrayed my nervousness. Maintaining outward composure, I said, But you agreed, didn't you? She seemed to see through my facade. Without further words, she looked into my eyes and said, each word measured and deliberate, Since there's a readily available wedding, let's get married now. What? Do you think? A heavy silence fell over the room. I saw Mr. and Mrs. Schu's faces turn ashen. A strange sense of satisfaction washed over me. I took Victoria's hand. She stood, a vision in white, beside me, truly resembling a bride. Looking into her eyes, I finally let out a breath. We walked to the stage amidst the expectant stares of the guests. Before we reached the stage, she leaned down and whispered, You knew I would agree, didn't you? I was taken aback, instinctively looking at her, but she simply returned to her composure and stood at center stage. Suppressing my thoughts, I smiled at the audience. The wedding continued. As Mr. and Mrs. Schu had said, even with Sophie's elopement, the wedding had to proceed. The S family needed this wedding to maintain our already precarious position. I had been unconscious for 3 years. In many people's eyes, I was a complete wreck. From today, I had to show them that even with my 3-year absence, I was still Sebastian. The vows I had originally intended for Sophie, I now offered to another woman. Under the watchful eyes of everyone, we exchanged rings. The officiant asked, Mr. S., do you take Victoria to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer? Until death do you part? I do, I answered without hesitation. The officiant wiped his brow, seeming flustered by the unprecedented situation, a bride eloping and the groom immediately replacing her. He then turned to Victoria. Ms. Liu, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part? Victoria gazed into my eyes, as if searching my soul. Holding my finger, she slid the ring onto my finger and in her clear, sweet voice said, I do. Mr. and Mrs. Shu, unable to endure the spectacle any longer, rose and left the ceremony, their faces cold with anger. Almost everyone stayed until the end. Even with their extreme displeasure, they had to consider Mr. Shu's face. After all, Victoria was now the Shu family's most influential heir. From initial shock to eventual acceptance, my father looked at me with a hint of admiration. Sebastian, he said after the ceremony, you took a huge risk. The S family has regained face, but have you considered what would have happened if Victoria had refused? Your situation would have been far more difficult. Dad, don't worry. I knew what I was doing, I replied. He didn't know that while I was nervous, it wasn't a complete gamble. I wouldn't have been so impulsive if I didn't have some assurance. A knock came at the door. My father and I looked up. Victoria stood there, leaning against the frame, a faint smile on her lips. Excuse me, she said. My father cleared his throat and said, I'll be going then. He tactfully left us alone, nodding to Victoria as he passed. To our shock, Victoria responded naturally, Goodbye, Dad. I stared at her, dumbfounded, as she watched my father leave. My father paused and glanced back at me, as if about to say something, but then looked at Victoria and left without a word. I walked to Victoria, thought for a moment, and softly said, Thank you for what you did at the wedding. She didn't turn around. You said you had a plan. There's no need to thank me, she said, her voice devoid of warmth, as if deliberately creating distance. I frowned. It seemed Victoria had overheard my conversation with my father. She turned, her gaze fixed on me. However, she said, You're certainly bold. Did you not consider the consequences at all? I met her eyes, clenching my fist. Considering our current positions, I exhaled. I heard what you said to Mr. Shu that day, I said. We're married now, regardless of how we got here, we're in this together. I felt obligated to be honest with her. She frowned slightly. Heard what? Mr. Shu originally intended for you to marry into the S family and for me to marry you, I said. She raised an eyebrow, intrigued, urging me to continue. The outside world believed Mr. Shu would marry his heir to a prominent family to solidify the Shu family's power, I explained. Therefore, everyone disapproved of Sophie being with me. Her family even hoped I'd never wake up, allowing them to choose a son-in-law more acceptable to Mr. Shu. But Sophie insisted on marrying me, thwarting their plans and seemingly putting them at a disadvantage in the succession battle. Her eyes grew serious. I continued, but in reality, Mr. Shu never intended to marry his heir into a so-called prominent family. That would only weaken the Shu family's influence and power. He always wanted you to marry into the S family and for me to marry you. It would have been far simpler for the Shu family. Even without extra support, a family like the Shus doesn't need help. It's simply the power-hungry children trying to collude with outside forces to divide Mr. Shu's holdings. But Mr. Shu didn't want that, therefore I was the best choice. I was surprised to hear their conversation that day, I admitted. There were so many hidden agendas. The person who married me was the most likely to become the heir. The S family, while a prominent family, had fallen on hard times years ago. If not for the engagement with the Shus, we would have been completely sidelined. We posed no threat to the Shu family's control. But on the other hand, we're still a prominent family, albeit fallen, with established roots and strong parental upbringing, better than an outsider. Therefore, overall, I was the best choice. Knowing this, I had the courage to approach Victoria when Sophie ran away from her wedding. But I was nervous. I wasn't sure how much she craved power. After all, replacing her sister at the wedding and marrying her fiancé was quite shocking. But luckily I won the gamble. Victoria narrowed her eyes, a smile playing on her lips. "It seems I underestimated you," she said, leaning closer. Her breath brushed my face. "From now on," she whispered, "you're my husband, Sebastian." This sudden intimacy made me instinctively take a step back. But Victoria wouldn't let me escape. Not wanting to hurt her, I allowed her to close the distance. My back was against the hard wall, her soft fragrance filling the air. I was trapped, surrounded by her scent. "Victoria," I said uncomfortably, "don't push me. I'm a perfectly normal man. Just so happens my wife is you." Just then, my phone rang. Victoria took it from my pocket. Sophie's name flashed on the screen. My breath hitched. I felt a strange pang of guilt, like being caught cheating. Seeing Sophie's name, my warmth vanished, as if someone had thrown a bucket of cold water over me. I'll never forget her leaving me at the altar for Ethan, but I also won't forget her care during my 3 years of illness. She simply fell out of love, or perhaps fell in love with someone else. I couldn't blame her, but I couldn't forgive her either. Victoria saw my hesitation. She held my hand, offering me the phone. "Answer," she said, her tone cold, commanding. "I don't want to hear her voice right now," I frowned. Victoria pursed her lips, displeased. "Don't want to, or are you afraid to?" I frowned, remaining silent. Victoria laughed derisively, tapping the screen to answer the call. My eyes widened. Before I could react, Sophie's voice filled the air. "Sebastian, are you there?" My chest heaved, overwhelmed by emotion. I wasn't ready to face her, but Victoria forced me to. Looking up, I met her haughty gaze. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. "Sophie," I asked, "what do you want?" She paused, sensing the coldness in my voice. "Sebastian, I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you. I'll give you a grand wedding." I shook my head. "No, it's really not necessary. The wedding went on. I just married someone else." She replied, "Don't be mad at me. I know I did wrong, but Ethan's situation was urgent. I just didn't want to see him die." Her voice was full of remorse. She said, "Sebastian, I want to marry you. Can I come back after I handle this?" Before she could finish, Ethan's pained groan echoed from the other end of the line. Sophie's voice immediately became anxious. "Sebastian, I'll be back as soon as I take care of Ethan." Then she hung up. Victoria asked, "Are you upset?" She leaned in close. "I don't need a husband who grieves over other women." I shook my head and said, "Not really, but please give me some time," she said. "I'll give you 3 months. There were practical considerations for marrying you, but I don't intend to leave." Her tone was cold, yet complex. "In 3 months, deal with your feelings and commit yourself fully to me." Almost overnight, the entire city of Charleston knew about my marriage to Victoria, except for Sophie. After she eloped from the wedding, she vanished from the public eye. Word was that she had saved Ethan and successfully dealt with the kidnapper, the woman who had betrayed him 3 years prior, his girlfriend at the time. After their breakup, she was sent to prison. Now, after serving her 3-year sentence, she resumed harassing Ethan. Ethan, unable to cope, sought Sophie's help. Sophie had helped him several times, and perhaps their feelings developed through this back and forth. Even Sophie herself hadn't realized she had fallen for Ethan. She simply didn't want to break her promise to me. She said she would return to marry me after she finished handling everything, but she actually stayed with Ethan for a whole week, caring for him in the hospital, helping him recover both physically and emotionally. She didn't even consider the consequences of leaving me at the wedding, nor did she spare a moment for me, not even once. While with Ethan, she completely forgot about me. A week was enough for me to adjust. I moved into my marital home with Victoria. The Shu family lived in a sprawling estate. I initially thought she would be living with them, but Victoria had her own separate residence. I was worried about constantly running into Sophie if I lived with the Shu family, fearing awkward encounters. Now that was no longer a concern. Initially, everyone wanted to see me fail, to see how I, a man who had been dormant for 3 years, would react to being abandoned by Sophie. But now everyone was anticipating Sophie's reaction. Finally, on the 8th day after Sophie had resolved Ethan's situation and returned to find me, she discovered that the wedding had continued. Only the bride had changed. Victoria, and I had been sleeping in separate rooms. That night, Victoria knocked on my door. "What is it?" I asked. She walked in, said nothing, closed the door and said, "Sophie's back, you know, right?" My expression changed. "Of course. My friends have already sent me messages, some genuinely concerned, others just looking for a good laugh." Sophie's news was the first I received. "What are your thoughts?" she asked, looking into my eyes. I shook my head. "What can I think? It's done. She and I are in the past. To me, she's just my wife's sister." My words seemed to please Victoria. Her eyes softened. "Good. You understand your situation. We have a special status. I expect you to get my permission before each meeting with her, and ideally you should not meet again." She appeared calm, yet I saw a storm brewing beneath her placid gaze. That night she fell asleep in my arms. My arms were stiff, I dared not move, until just before falling asleep I heard her whisper, "If you can't sleep now, you can sleep on the plane tomorrow." I frowned. "Where? Are we going tomorrow?" "Our honeymoon," she said, nuzzling into me. Amazingly, I fell asleep. The next morning, she was dressed and had packed her bags. "Let's go," she said, "my Mr. S." I thought it was a typical honeymoon until I saw Sophie's car downstairs. I glanced at Victoria in surprise. As we were about to leave, Sophie got out of the car. "Sebastian," she called, her voice filled with unprecedented urgency. As I and Victoria got into the car, ready for our honeymoon, Victoria angrily put her arm around me. "Don't see her. You promised me yesterday." "Don't see her?" I asked. "You know she's coming to find me today," she replied, her voice cold but with a suppressed anger. "Sebastian," she said, "I hate broken promises. Don't get out of the car, don't see her." It was clearly a threat, yet I detected a hint of nervousness. I took a deep breath. "Don't worry," I said. "I won't go out. I didn't want to see her anyway." I remained in the car, perfectly still. I could see Victoria get out. The windows were one-way mirrored. Sophie never knew I was watching her from so close. This was our first meeting since her runaway wedding. She looked haggard, her makeup smudged, her clothes worn. I wondered if it was her time with Ethan, her worry for him, that made her neglect herself. The next second, Victoria was beside Sophie. "What is it?" Victoria asked. "I want to see Sebastian," Sophie cried, clutching Victoria's sleeve, her eyes fixed on her. "He said he'd wait for me." "He didn't say that," Victoria retorted, forcefully shaking off Sophie's grip. "Tell me, who did he marry?" Sophie asked, her eyes red. "Is he just angry with me?" I frowned. She still didn't know I was the one who married Victoria, her sister. Their parents had intentionally kept it from her, though the whole city knew. It was only a matter of time before the truth came out. I wondered if Victoria would tell Sophie the devastating news. Victoria hesitated for a few seconds, ultimately choosing not to reveal it then. "Sebastian's married to someone else," she said. "There's no point in seeing him. He'll have nothing to do with you anymore." "You're lying. He's just mad at me," Sophie insisted, her voice trembling slightly, yet laced with self-assuredness. "We've been together for years. I took care of him for 3 years when he was in a vegetative state. He knows I love him. He's just angry that I saved another man." She knew. I closed my eyes, feeling a surge of bitter irony. She knew, yet she still left me at the altar. She was right, we had years of history. She cared for me for 3 years, never giving up on me. If she had just told me she'd changed her mind, I would have been heartbroken. but I would have wished her well. She shouldn't have done this, humiliating me in front of everyone. "He won't forgive you," Victoria said. "You know his personality better than I do. But from now on, you're no longer the one who knows him best." Before Sophie could question her further, Victoria turned and got back into the car, separating me from Sophie. The moment she was inside, she leaned into me. "If you even look at her again, you're dead." It was a blatant threat, but I sensed her underlying anxiety. "I promise I won't have anything to do with her," I said. "It won't affect our family's union, and I won't embarrass you." But I pushed her away, smoothing my clothes. "Do you have to lecture me like I'm having an affair?" She narrowed her eyes, unfazed by my sarcasm, even nodding in agreement. "You're right, so stay away from her." Impatient, I stared out the window, motionless. The car started moving. She clearly didn't want me to see Sophie again. I could only watch her familiar figure in the rearview mirror, fading into the distance. In my heart, I whispered, "Goodbye, my girl. From now on, we're strangers." Our honeymoon was in Las Vegas. "I thought you'd pick a place for business," I said. Victoria gave me a subtle look. "How do you know this isn't for business?" She'd booked the presidential suite on the top floor of a hotel with breathtaking views. I didn't argue. I sat on the large bed as she rose from her laptop, approaching me, her hands on either side of my shoulders. "Our wedding night seems to have only just begun," she said. I hesitated, looking at her with complex emotions. Victoria leaned in. "Sebastian, I've given you time. Don't forget, we're officially married. I'm not getting a divorce, and I'm not settling for a loveless marriage." "I know," I replied. "I knew our marriage wasn't a sham, and I knew this day would come, but I didn't expect it so soon." She reached for my shirt, her movements hesitant, as if trying to hide her inexperience. I chuckled softly, seeing through her pretense, and patiently guided her. Her tone was usually sharp, but tonight it was incredibly gentle. So gentle it left me slightly disoriented. The night was extraordinarily long. The physical intimacy brought us closer. This honeymoon surprisingly felt like we grew even more intimate. Her words echoed in my mind. "We're husband and wife, partners in this. Believe me, I'll never do anything to hurt you." I found her words more convincing than any empty promises of love. Upon our return to Los Angeles, as we exited the plane and arrived at LAX, we saw a familiar figure, Sophie. I barely glanced at her before my face fell. Sophie had been constantly contacting me throughout the honeymoon, driving me to distraction. I'd finally changed my number, but she'd somehow tracked down my flight. Victoria quickly pulled me away, preventing Sophie from seeing me. Our car was waiting. I looked back and saw more than one person there. Ethan was beside her, his eyes red. "He's married. Why are you so obsessed with him?" he cried. Sophie said, "He's just angry I left him to save you that day. If I explain that he's the only one I love, he'll come back." The kidnapped Ethan looked surprisingly well, likely due to Sophie's care. I looked away, strangely free of the agonizing pain I'd felt before. We soon arrived at our new house in Beverly Hills. Only as we got out of the car did I realize I was holding Victoria's hand. Our relationship had progressed rapidly during the honeymoon. I cleared my throat, letting go. Victoria looked at me with concern. "Are you uncomfortable?" she asked. "No," I said. "Then why are you avoiding me?" she asked, taking my hand again. "Was I too demanding lately?" "I'm sorry. You just woke up from a coma. I shouldn't be so inconsiderate." "It's not that," I said, glaring at her. I didn't know if she was being deliberate or genuinely worried. Even if her needs were greater, I could still provide. Victoria chuckled softly, her cheeks flushed, a rare sight. "Tell me if anything's bothering you," she said. "I know," I replied, still slightly uncomfortable with her sudden tenderness. As soon as we got home, my brother called. You know Sophie's been searching everywhere for you?" he asked. My brother Jack was a longtime friend. He'd been thrilled to hear I'd woken up. He'd expected me and Sophie to work out, but this was unexpected. Leaving, You at the altar to save another man? I don't know what she was thinking. If she loved you so much, she shouldn't have hurt you, Jack raged. I shrugged, feeling oddly unmoved by the news of Sophie. She just didn't realize she loved Ethan. Her feelings for me were an obsession. I don't blame her. She took care of me for 3 years. Once she figures it out, she'll stop looking for me, I said. Is that so? She doesn't seem like she'll give up, Jack replied, then immediately hushed, sighing. Sebastian, you don't know how crazy she's been. She searched all over San Francisco, turning the city upside down. Someone leaked that you were on a honeymoon, so she tried to go abroad, but her parents stopped her. After a few days of quiet, she started investigating the woman you married, but found nothing. Seeing how frantic she was, we couldn't tell her who you married. She seems to suspect something, but whether she'll admit it, I don't know. I shook my head. He sighed and hung up. As soon as he did, a light rain began, quickly escalating into a downpour, battering the windows. I stood on the balcony looking down when I saw a familiar figure, Sophie, standing in the rain. My heart skipped a beat. My first reaction wasn't pity, but a realization that she probably knew. I chuckled to myself. What was there to worry about? The whole city knew she'd find out eventually. I was prepared. What was there to feel guilty about? Turning around, I saw Victoria standing behind me, silently watching. I expected anger, but she said nothing, just watched. After a long pause, she said coldly, "If you want to see her, go." I shook my head decisively. No. As I walked past her, Victoria grabbed my sleeve. "It's time to settle this. I finally understand." A wave of clarity washed over me. I looked at Victoria deeply and said, "I'm going to see Sophie. What? If she makes a scene? With me here, she won't dare," Victoria said coldly, confidently, even with a hint of disdain. She clearly didn't think much of Sophie. Sophie was outside the gates of the mansion, blocked by the iron railings. The rain had washed over them, leaving an eerie metallic sheen that glistened in the darkness. She stood there, drenched, head bowed like a stray dog. I stood at the doorway, whispering, "Go home." Her eyes lit up when she saw me. She instinctively grabbed the railing, saying, "Sebastian, you finally agreed to see me." I didn't move. Through the rain, I said, "I've seen you. Go home." My voice was cold. She calmed down. Her dark eyes looked at me. "If you come home with me, I'll leave," she said. I suddenly laughed. In this torrential rain, I was actually laughing. "You should know I'm married," I said. "Going home with you wouldn't be appropriate." Her body trembled slightly. I had noticed earlier she was deliberately ignoring my marriage, but my direct statement shattered her self-deception. "Sebastian, do you have to do this to me?" she choked out. "They say you're with my sister. I refuse to believe it. Even if you wanted revenge, you wouldn't choose this way." "It's not revenge," I interrupted. "She's my best choice." I looked at her calmly. "Sophie, you're mistaken. I was hurt when you ran away from the wedding, but I don't resent you. I know you were good to me. You protected me for 3 years and you were kind to my parents, so between us, let's call it even." She stared at me, her expression bordering on collapse. I felt a pang of sympathy, but I held her gaze. "This is the best outcome for both of us. Let's not see each other again." "No!" She lunged forward, seizing my wrist. "Open the door, let me in. I'll take you away. I know you're angry, I know I was wrong. I shouldn't have left you, but I really had no other choice." I sighed. "I know you wouldn't stand by and watch Ethan die. You were worried about him. You love him. You just don't realize it." I was determined to shatter her facade, looking at her with calm and steady eyes. "Don't worry, I'll wish you both well." She was close to breaking down. "I don't love him. I love you, Sebastian. Don't do this to me." I frowned. "If you didn't love him, why did you choose him over me without hesitation? You know it wasn't a life or death situation. There were police, bodyguards, professional rescuers. You weren't even needed. Yet you went. Because he's the one you love most. Nothing in this world matters more than his safety. You went, even sacrificing my face and dignity. Isn't that love?" Her face turned pale. The woman who once loved me so deeply had fallen for someone else. Regardless, a quick end is better than prolonged suffering. Dwelling on sadness is unforgivable. I lost 3 years. 3 years I made those who cared for me wait. I can't let my relationship issues drag them down again. Clearly, Sophie no longer loved me, at least not exclusively. She loved someone else. "No, I don't. I don't like him," she said, looking at me in panic. "Sebastian, I've always loved you, really? Do you believe that yourself?" I asked, turning to see Ethan standing behind her, his face etched with hurt as he looked at her. "Sophie, don't you love me?" he asked, his voice hoarse, his face wet with rain. Sophie froze for a moment that answered my question. I pried her hands off me. "Go to him," I said. "It's raining too hard. He just got rescued. His health can't take it." I'm not magnanimous enough to bless them, but Sophie was incredibly kind to me. She cared for me during my 3 years of recovery. I don't deny her love for me. Perhaps she still loves me most, but she undeniably loves Ethan too. I have a strong aversion to infidelity. I can't tolerate such a fickle relationship. It's not what I want. Sophie finally realized, pushing Ethan away to hug me. "I'm so sorry, Sebastian. I only felt sorry for him. I'm truly sorry. I'll never leave you again. Victoria's all I have. She's the most important person to me. Don't leave." Her voice was almost choked with sobs. "If I'd known saving him would mean losing you, I would never have left," she said. Ethan froze, his heart wrenching as he nearly yelled, "I don't believe you, Sophie. Look me in the eyes. Don't. You have any feelings for me? I know I shouldn't be with you. I shouldn't have fallen for you, but feelings aren't something we can control. Sebastian just appeared in your life first. If it weren't for him, we would be together." "Shut up," Sophie angrily interrupted. "I only love Sebastian, and I always will. It's impossible between us and you." Ethan shouted, "Stop deceiving yourself. You clearly love me. Why would you leave him at the wedding and come find me if you didn't?" This was something he'd been questioning her about constantly. Sophie couldn't seem to find the answer herself, so she remained silent, stubbornly looking at him and saying, "Sebastian, believe me." Just as her hand reached for his, a sweet yet furious voice rang out. "Why should he believe you?" I turned to see a beautiful face, familiar yet unfamiliar. "Victoria." I was surprised. "Didn't you say I should handle it myself?" Victoria didn't answer. Instead, she nestled into my arms, her gaze cold as she looked at Sophie. "Show some respect. He's your brother-in-law." The words brother-in-law were a huge blow to Sophie. Unable to contain herself, she lunged at Victoria, yelling, "What kind of family are you? You know I love him. Why are you doing this to me?" Victoria seemed amused. "If you really loved him, you wouldn't have given me this chance." Sophie seemed frozen, her tears blurring in the rain. I couldn't tell if she was crying, only seeing the redness around her eyes. Victoria glanced at her. "If you want a cat fight, feel free. But he's my husband now. Don't bother him again." Without changing her expression, she took my arm and went home. Once inside, she impulsively kissed me, preventing me from moving, forceful yet alluring. Before I could say her name, I tasted her tears. My heart ached. I felt pity for her. That night, I was relentless. Though she was clearly overwhelmed, she clawed at me like a wildcat. Even as she was limp in my arms, she hissed, "Don't see her again." I was caught in her vortex, lost and confused, only able to nod. After that night, Sophie and Ethan faded from my life. I heard Sophie was seriously ill, the storm having taken a toll on her. Those who'd wanted to see us fail fell silent. Only Sophie's parents found me, their faces etched with exhaustion and anger. "Sebastian, you won," Mrs. S. sneered, her tiredness betraying her sarcastic tone. "Sophie's hospitalized. Go see her." I frowned. "Ethan's with her. Or you are. You're her family." Mrs. S. practically gritted her teeth, her expression furious. He's the only one who matters to her. Are you proud of yourself? Even now, he's the only one she wants to see. I rubbed my temples, but I don't want to see her. I said to her, our positions make it inappropriate. They understood. I was her brother-in-law. We shouldn't see each other. Mrs. S.'s eyes welled up. You won't forgive her? What terrible thing did she do to deserve this? I gave a wry smile. She didn't do anything wrong. She just ran away from her wedding. Their expressions shifted. So what? That doesn't prove anything. She cared for you for 3 years. You were in a coma, and she never left you or saw another man. Doesn't that show her devotion? I replied, so I don't blame her for running away from the wedding. But that's it, our feelings, they can't go back. My voice was flat. Please leave, it's over between us. Mrs. S. stared at me, incredulous, unable to reason. Mr. S. stepped forward, his eyes icy. Are you going to watch her die? That's a bit dramatic, I replied to her. It's just a breakup. You're not going to blame her death on me, are you? Finally, Mrs. S. couldn't hold back, crying, just see her, please. I'm begging you. I nodded. I promised her. My breakup with Sophie was abrupt, and it was time for a clean break to ensure she wouldn't bother me again. Neither of us anticipated Victoria's insistence on joining us. When Sophie's parents saw Victoria in the hospital room, their faces went pale. Sophie's mother said, Sebastian, we asked you to come. Why did you bring her? Victoria, calmly holding my arm, looked at them and said, he's my husband. I have the right to know where he is. While Victoria parried with them, I pushed open the door and entered the room. Sophie lay in bed looking frail. They hadn't lied. She was truly ill. Seeing me, she coughed, sat up weakly and said, Sebastian, you came. A wry smile touched her lips. I thought you'd never see me again. I nodded. We shouldn't see each other again. This is the last time. Why? She asked, her eyes welling up. Don't you forgive me? I shook my head. We were brother-in-law and sister-in-law. There's nothing to forgive. The moment the words left my mouth, she seemed to hear something devastating, closing her eyes and saying, don't say any more. You must hate me. Because hate implies caring. If you don't hate me, it means you've let go. I was speechless, unsure how to respond. After a long pause, I whispered, if you think I hate you, then I hate you. Suddenly, she rushed to embrace me, her voice choked with emotion. Why don't you hate me? I did something wrong. You should hate me. I said wryly, you know that running away from our wedding was wrong, don't you? Her body stiffened. She stammered an apology. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. I don't know what I was thinking. Please forgive me. I frowned. I just said there's nothing to forgive. Have you forgotten? I smiled. I never blamed you. But the more I said this, the more despair filled her expression. Then don't forgive me. Hate me, Sebastian. Please hate me. I sighed. Why should I hate you? Our past was beautiful. I don't want to hate you. It wouldn't mean anything. Can't you just live a peaceful life with Ethan? She seized on this like a lifeline, looking into my eyes. I've cut ties with him. I sent him away that day. I'll never involve myself with him again. I'm sorry, Sebastian, truly sorry. I shouldn't have done that to you. I love you. You should know. He can't compare to you. I exhaled. Don't lie to me anymore. You fell for him. You know I don't mind. You were wonderful to me when we were together. You never wronged me. You took care of me when I was near death, so I bless you both. As I spoke, I glanced towards the restroom, knowing Ethan was inside. I understood Sophie. She might believe she loved me, and I believed her love, but it was split, given to another. I didn't want that kind of love. I knew others were present, but I said it anyway, because I knew it was the last time. But Ethan clearly didn't think so. The next second, he stormed out of the restroom. Sebastian, you're too much. You don't deserve her love. Seeing him, Sophie was surprised. What are you doing here? She exclaimed. her brow furrowed in annoyance. "Didn't I tell you to leave?" Then she cautiously looked at me, as if afraid I'd be angry. "Sebastian, I'm sorry, I didn't know he was here." I shook my head. "We're through. Even if you're with him, I won't say anything." I smiled indifferently. "Of course, if you're with another man, I'll bless you even more sincerely. After all." I glanced at Ethan. I became a vegetable to save him. Ethan fell silent, then grumbled resentfully. "That's a debt I owe you, but Sophie doesn't owe you anything. Why are you doing this to her? She loves you so much." "Oh, really?" I asked. "Didn't you claim she was already in love with you, but unaware of it?" His expression shifted, and he fell silent. Sophie looked at me sadly, her eyes red. "No matter what, I've only ever loved you. I admit I felt some sympathy for him, but it's nothing compared to my love for you. You should understand me," I sighed. "Sophie, I'm sorry. I can never accept love with any impurities. You should understand me." Sophie finally couldn't help but her eyes redden. She said, "If I say I'll kneel and beg you to stay with me." Ethan's eyes also reddened. He said, "Stay with her, please, I beg you." The next second, a voice came. "Who do you think you are? What right do you have to beg him?" The hospital room door was suddenly flung open, and Victoria strode in, letting out a sneer. Looking at Ethan, she said, "You're the least qualified person here to speak." Ethan was startled when he saw her. After a moment, he recovered and said, "It's you. You're Sophie's sister, the one who stole her beloved man." Victoria replied, "I didn't steal him. She gave him away willingly." Victoria's expression was calm as she said, "He believed your stupid words, and that's why he lost the one he loved. It's a consequence of her own actions." Ethan shouted, "That's because Sophie didn't love me. If she loved me, I would have done better than Sebastian." "Sebastian never loved her. He married you so quickly. He never deserved her love," Victoria asked. "Oh? Running away from your wedding in public? Making him a laughingstock? You think that's love?" Victoria continued, sneering, "I won't deny she truly loved him before, and is genuinely remorseful now. But for Sebastian, a relationship with impurities, with cracks, can never be repaired. And you are that stain." Victoria looked at him with disdain. "You're the last person who should say that. Regardless, Sebastian saved your life. You seem to have completely forgotten. If it weren't for you, Sebastian would have married Sophie long ago. There wouldn't be you or me. He saved you and ended up with nothing. His fiancée ran away with you on their wedding day, and you say he didn't deserve her? The only one who doesn't deserve anything is you. You don't deserve Sebastian's life-saving grace." Ethan's face turned pale, his hands constantly fumbling behind him. I squinted and saw he was actually live streaming. He stammered, unable to articulate a coherent response. Victoria let out a cold laugh. "See, I'm right. Sophie wouldn't hurt Sebastian this much with anyone else. But she left him for you on their wedding day. How do you think that made Sebastian feel?" I hadn't expected Victoria to understand me so well. Her voice was cold. "It's double betrayal. He saved your life, and you not only didn't show gratitude, you stole his woman." She then sarcastically glanced at Sophie. "I believe your sincerity towards Sebastian, but your sincerity is rather ridiculous. The fact that you fell for a man like this proves you two are birds of a feather." Sophie seemed deeply impacted, looking at me with immense regret. "I'm sorry, Sebastian. It's all my fault. I shouldn't have left you. I promise I'll never see him again. I truly have no feelings for him. Many relationships start from pity," I said to Sophie. "We're over. Even Victoria understands me. I can't accept love with impurities. Doesn't she know?" Sophie suddenly looked at Victoria with intense emotion. "What about her? Can she guarantee she'll only love you for life? Never waver?" She then looked at me pleadingly. "Sebastian, I'll never make the same mistake again. You're the only person I want to spend my life with, ever." Ethan choked back tears, looking at her. "Did you never love me?" "Yes," Sophie answered resolutely. "I never loved you. Perhaps there was pity, but I'd never abandon Sebastian for you. Ethan finally gave up, dropping his phone and leaving. The live stream was still on. Victoria immediately cut it off. Sophie's face turned pale, then she gave a wry smile. I lost you because of a man like that. Ethan hid in the bathroom to live stream, hoping to make me the laughingstock, to tell everyone Sophie had fallen for someone else. But it was he who became the joke. Later, Name angrily said, I've disliked Ethan for a long time. He was saved by you. Yet he stole your woman and showed no remorse, only pretending in front of Sophie. Thankfully, Victoria and he got what they deserved. Otherwise, I'd have been furious on your behalf. After that all-night talk, I haven't seen Sophie much, but I heard she didn't end up with Ethan. After that incident, his reputation in the circle plummeted. He repeatedly sought Sophie's help, but Mr. S told me she ignored him. Regardless, Victoria is her sister. I thought we'd occasionally bump into each other, but Victoria completely avoided any encounters. I always believed our marriage was a business arrangement, but during our time together our feelings grew. I did consider what Sophie said. Could Victoria guarantee her devotion to me? I think because I didn't expect much from her, I didn't care. I didn't have strong feelings for her. We were together because it was a suitable marriage. Perhaps it wasn't based on love, but on shared interests and goals. Without expectations, there was no dissatisfaction. I didn't expect her to give me such unexpected security. Almost everyone joked that the icy beauty had become a lovesick fool, a devoted wife and mother, something she'd always despised. She never made promises but showed me through her actions that she only had eyes for me. She said, I dedicate most of my time to work, leaving little for my personal life. Believe it or not, I don't have the energy for feelings for other men. Once Victoria looked at me seriously and said, I'm not emotionally expressive. Not as kind as Sophie. I wouldn't sympathize with other men. I'm cold-blooded, but I'm never cold towards you. Her tone was sarcastic when she mentioned kindness. I chuckled. It's been so long, let's not dwell on it. Our life continued slowly and warmly. Victoria became pregnant, and the baby's arrival made her very happy. Many gradually forgot about my past with Sophie. I believe she's moved on too. Later, at my child's first birthday party, Sophie, whom I hadn't seen in ages, finally appeared. She said nothing, had a new haircut, and looked like the bright girl she once was, only more mature. She placed a gift in my hands. Victoria watched her warily, preventing excessive interaction. Sophie smiled faintly. Don't worry, I've let go of him. She left the gift and a letter. Victoria insisted I read the letter in front of her. I didn't want to, but she wouldn't let me refuse. The letter read, I've let go of you, but you'll always be in my heart, Sebastian. When you were with me, I was emotionally vibrant. I loved, I hated, I felt compassion. But I didn't expect this vibrancy to tear us apart, to make you leave. Only after you left did I become truly hollow, unable to love or hate. But I realized this too late. I completely lost you. If I could do it again. She didn't continue. I couldn't bring myself to finish reading either. As she said, it was too late. I have my life, she has her future. I'll continue on my path without compromise or regret.